I'm Adi Wood, not Adrian Wood as people often think I am, because it's like people see me in the magazine, or they've seen me in White Dwarf magazine and will see the name Adrian Wood. Actually, I'm Adi Wood, and I've always been Adi Wood. Only my mother calls me Adrian, usually when she's very cross with me. Even at like 89, she can still get very cross with me. I started working at Games Workshop in 1993 and was with Games Workshop for 25 years. So I finished in 2018. When I initially came into the company, I'd just been made redundant from my previous job, and I was literally going, and I'd seen an advert for a production assistant for the studio, and I thought to myself, well, I'm a graphic designer, I can do this kind of work. I'd be a complete idiot if I didn't actually go after a job like this. It'd be a great opportunity. They wanted the minimum of a year's experience. I thought, well, I'd worked at Ladybird Books, I'd worked in a school, I'd done all sorts of different kinds of work. I've got plenty of experience, so let's just go for it and see what happens. So I was interviewed by a guy called Chris Colston and Robin Dews, who was the editor of White Dwarf magazine. And he and Chris kind of basically interviewed me, and they were kind of going, well, you've got all the skills we need, you've got a great attitude. Robin said to me, well, you've got great eye contact, actually. You have a way of actually, you look people in the eye and you don't waver that kind of thing. So I thought, okay, that's very nice of you to say so. And he said, well, the only problem we've got is that you're a bit old. And I kind of went, oh, okay, so I'm a bit old, am I? I was 28 at the time. And I figured out very, very quickly that what they meant is we're used to taking on a teenager straight out of art college, paying them a pittance, and they might hang around for a couple of years until maybe they get a better opportunity and then they move on. And whereas I was someone who was actually a reasonably seasoned professional, even though I was 28, and still looking back on it now, reasonably young and a very young head on my shoulders as well. And it was very much a case of, I thought to myself, well, actually, I need to convince these people that actually I'm not bothered about having a big salary. So I said I'm quite happy to start on whatever wage. I said at the time it was something probably ridiculous, like $5,000 or something like that. It's something like really, really, really small. But and they kind of were a bit taken aback by that and kind of said, "Oh, well, that's fine then." If you're gonna start on something like that, we'll definitely take you then. I thought you would. Whereas I was very much seeing it as just a way of getting my foot in the door and just kind of seeing what happened, really. So I came in and spent my first week getting used to using an Apple Mac computer, which I'd not used before. I get this. I mean, this is funny. I'd pretty much blagged my way into using computers. I'd had no training on using computers at all, and I'd literally just I'd got a computer at home that I messed about with, and I just blagged my way in, and kind of said, well, I've used in my previous job, we'd use the computer to really just print out reams of text that we then cut up and manually pasted up, because that's how you kind of did that kind of thing. in the kind of the 80s and into the 90s. But we were transitioning at that moment into using computers, and I kind of went, well, great, let's see what happens. I'll start to lay stuff out, actually using the computer program, which was great. They didn't have graphic designers from the point of view that everything was based on format. So you had a page layout that was maintained and remained the same all the time. And so literally you were just like putting text in place, putting artwork in, putting little filler illustrations in to break things up. And it was all pretty like formatable, and you kind of just, you didn't really have to think too much about doing any actual design, because you were more interested in just getting this layout together. So I started to get used to that, which is fine. I took to it pretty easily. It didn't take long. By the end of the week, they'd already played a battle report that week between, I think it was Robin and Gary. Oh God, his name's gone out of my head. One of the figure designers, and Gary Morley. Yeah, thanks for helping me with that. Honestly, I am so rubbish at names. Gary Morley. It's like, a name's going to go out of my head. It's gone. And so, and they'd done this battle report, and they said, well, how do you fancy having photographing it, doing all the photographs? Yeah, I'll do that. So by the end of my first week, I'd laid out an advert, laid out an article. I'd done some battle report photography, and Robin pulled me to one side pretty much at the end of that week and said, well, just so you understand, you're on a 3-month probation, but I can tell you now, we're going to be keeping you, because we knew within a couple of days that you were pretty much perfect for what you wanted. You're willing to learn, you're willing to have a crack at anything, and that's all great. So I had a great time. My first month or so, like working in White Dwarf was probably the best. It's ridiculous to say, really, thinking of it in those terms, because everything seemed to be fine. But Robin wanted another editor to come in, and he got Jake Thornton in, and he came in and started to work on the editorial side. And eventually, Robin decided that he would make Jake the editor of the whole of White Dwarf, so he'd effectively take over running White Dwarf while he went on to being studio manager. And that was over the space of a couple of years. This constantly rolling monthly program of what we were doing. About halfway through that, I think it was halfway through that, because I was on White Dwarf for about 5 years. So about halfway through that, we started to do Fat Dwarf, which was where it was a lot bigger, a lot more pages, and there was a card section in the middle, and we started to do that, and we started to have a lot of problems hitting our deadlines, and that became a bit of an issue, and we were taking on more staff. And we, at one point, I think we had about 5 staff members who were working on White Dwarf. Jake was the senior editor of the magazine, but they'd elevated me to being production editor. That was the name, and that they gave me, which is just an excuse to pay me a bit more money, and and kind of say, well, you have a bit more of a senior position, so that the young guys who are coming into the team actually understand that you know what you're doing, and you're the person that you really need to be talking about if you need to know anything, which is kind of ended up being my role for most of my time at Games Workshop in a way, because I was there for such a long time that I was, most people, if you want to know anything, go and see Adi about it, because even if Adi doesn't know the answer, he probably knows who does, which is fairly accurate. So it's like, and so once again that kind of continued through. Jake was replaced as editor towards the end of my time on White Dwarf, and we had a few months where we had various other people in charge of what was going on, and then Paul Sawyer came in and he took on, and I was probably with Paul for about a year, and I just got to the point with White Dwarf where I kind of went. I remember being in this production meeting, and Paul said, right, that because he managed to get everything back on track, everything was working through smoothly, we were hitting our deadlines and everything. What he wanted to do was actually to try and build up. So rather than doing White Dwarf in 4 weeks, we did White Dwarf in 3 weeks, so we could then get ourselves ahead of the game, because he wanted to try and get it so we were actually, I don't know, about 3 months ahead. I don't know how far ahead they are now when they do White Dwarf, but that was very much what we were aiming for. And so, but he said, great, okay, that's that issue done. Right, straight on to the next one. And my stomach turned over, and I went, oh my goodness me, I think it's time I stopped doing this. And so I basically said, I don't think I want to do this anymore. I want to find a job doing something else in Games Workshop. So I then went on to work on the army books, the colour sections in the army books, and did that because I had all the photographic skills, I had all the writing skills and everything else, and I just went straight into doing that. So that was but even then, that wasn't the end of my time in White Dwarf, because after a few years of doing the army books and then I worked on the website for a while, and after working on the website for a while, which had a little bit of interaction with White Dwarf again, I then went into the hobby department and became effectively a professional writer. And in that time, I was writing articles that once again were feeding into White Dwarf. So, but then very much after, when I went into Black Library, I very much shut myself off from White Dwarf and had no real input in what White Dwarf did after that. Apart from, I think there were a couple of times when they interviewed me to talk about orcs and things like that for the odd article, because I've become so identified with orcs, which is funny really, because I always say that before I started at Games Workshop, I played any and every army that you could care to mention in 40k, including Epic, which is my favourite of the tabletop game systems. And yet when I got into White Dwarf, it was immediately, oh, he's an orc player, great, we'll get him playing. Oh, right then. So yes, so that was the entirety of my run on White Dwarf and my involvement in it. So to talk a bit more about the actual things that went on, the actual stuff that went on at White Dwarf. I think the thing I get the impression people are really, really interested in is the battle reports. It's one of the things that everyone always seemed to be most interested in those, and they were interesting in a lot of ways, because talking about how things evolved in the magazine, the idea of a battle report was something that you know, it was a feature of every issue. There was always a battle report in it, and in fact, in a lot of ways, the more even having the idea of having something in the magazine that was like a battle report, even if it wasn't a battle report, was one which was actually mooted, as certainly talked about, and I suspect they do a lot more of that now. The main thing that most people kind of often get wrong with battle reports is they think it's a real game, when it really, really isn't. A battle report is an advertising tool for whatever the latest thing is that's just come out. I mean, I'm sure a lot of people will be screaming at this interview, going, "We know that already, AD. Honestly, what kind of idiot do you think do you take us for?" Well, the amount of people who really do think that the battle reports are real, it's like, you try doing one. To give you an idea, there are a lot of elements to doing battle reports, and you have your two opponents. You have the armies that you're going to be using. You need to put together, from my own point of view, you put together an army list. That army list was based on the models that you had painted up. So a lot of the time, these armies were in no way real armies. I mean, eventually we got to the point where I was actually allowed to use my own orc armies in a battle report, and which made a massive difference, because suddenly I actually had an army that was a proper, fully functioning army, rather than something that was just a bunch of models put together to look pretty in photographs and on box covers and things like that, and on heavy metal pages. So we had to put an army together, and then we had to play the game through. And as you were playing the game, you had to take Polaroids of the action as you were doing it, and you had to have maps that you marked on all the moves as you were playing through it. So a battle report, I mean, most games might take a couple of hours to play. You'll spend an entire day doing a battle report, if not longer. There's no flow. There's no real kind of chance for to really get into the flow of anything that you're doing, and that's not what it's about anyway. I mean, it's not really a game in any manner, fashion, or form, really. So you then get to the end of the battle, whoever won or whoever lost, and then you would write up a conclusion. You'd have a piece of text that you would write, which would be why you chose your army, and then roughly the kind of plan of what you were going to actually try and achieve on the tabletop. Both of which were generally fabrications, because you chose the army, because it's the models that you had available to you, and because what you were trying to advertise. And tactics wise, well, and grand strategy, well, there's never any of that. It was more a case of get on the tabletop and see what happens. And then you wrote a kind of a conclusion, where most of my conclusions were foiled again. Not the greatest gamer in the world, and never have been. Not bad. I got quite good after a long time, but it's like, but I was fine, because it was I achieved the role that I needed to achieve on a battle report. There needed to be an opponent, and I was fine with that. And it's kind of that was all that's fine in theory, until we started to get opponents in who were from outside the company. We got one particular guy who came in, and I played battle report against him, and this is when we started to realise that there were some problems we were going to have to overcome if we're going to get people outside the company coming in. You think, well, what difference would that make? Well, most of the time, these people. Well, I often talk about the rules for of the games that you play. There are different versions of those rules. So there's the rules that you play with your mate at home when you play that game through, and you play that mate who you maybe play once a week or something like that. And so you'll have your version of the rules. And then, of course, you'll come into Games Workshop, and there'll be the version of games of the rules that people around the studio play. And then there's the version of the rules that the games developers play, which is a different thing again. And they're all slightly different from each other, because oftentimes what happens is that you'll streamline a set of rules. Like, for example, it's how I'm not going to worry about this bit of the rules or that bit of the rules, because it just slows things down. Particularly with the second edition of 40k, which was the boxed game, which was really a game designed for, I mean, actually, in many ways, worked really, really well to about 400 points with just a couple of squads fighting. That went really well, and in fact, spent a lot of time playing those size games because you could play it in about an hour in a lunchtime. Worked really great. But if you went any bigger than that, then suddenly a game would go from taking an hour to taking 3 hours to do, and it didn't take long for it to tip over into that, and it would take a long time to sort of actually kind of get through. Okay, so you wanted to try and speed things up about, so you'd streamline things a bit, line of sight to be a little bit more slapdash and a little bit more easy, and you don't worry about it too much. So the problem is that when you're playing a battle report, you have to play the actual rules, because that's kind of the point. So I was tasked with being host to this guy coming in and playing this battle report, who was he was out of retail. And so he was under quite a lot of pressure as the retail guy, not to look like a complete numpty in front of everybody, which I can understand. So I had to play host to him. I had to run it because I couldn't expect him to do anything other than play the game. So I had to. And we only really realised this after the event. I was running the game, playing the game, recording the game, photographing the game, doing the maps, and and I knew we were going to have problems when we began to play our first turn, and he set some scouts up. In this wood, and it's like the whole idea with scouts is yes they are hiding in a wood, but of course they're there because you can see they're there, and the idea was always that everybody knows where everybody is at any point on the tabletop. So I had a little unit of Gretchen, and I thought, okay, we'll send that unit of Gretchen to go and find them. And because they're hidden, we'll go. I'll use them to go. And this guy went, "That's cheating." I said, "What?" He said, "No, that's cheating. That is, you can't do that. You can't. My guys are hiding in that wood." And he and his mates, obviously, they'd created a house rule where if someone was in hiding, you can't see them, you can't detect them, they can lurk about there for as long as you like, and you're not allowed to know that they're there. So I had to drag him upstairs to have a word with the games developers, and I said, "Can you explain to him what the actual..." And this happened a couple of times. It was just got to be quite embarrassing after a while. Anyway, we romped through the rest of this game, and he managed to win it by zapping one of my characters. Fine, that's okay. And then at the end of all this, he kind of said his goodbyes, and that was it. So I was then left to take that battle report. He had to write his conclusion and his introduction, and I had to start to write up the whole thing. It was only really when I started to write up the whole battle report that I realised that actually, if there was a rule to be bent and broken, it had been bent and broken and absolutely annihilated. And we realised, for example, that he'd been shooting, because at the time there was a rule whereby you could only shoot the nearest target, because that was the target that was the threat. So it was like but he was shooting anybody he wanted to on the tabletop. So we had to write it. If you force, it's something called forcing your fire art, where you turn models so you can make somebody the nearest target by the positioning of, that he's looking over there now, which means that on his arc of fire, they are now the lead. So we had to write it like that, and we went through the whole thing, and we realised that the biggest error we'd actually made with that battle report was expecting one person to be able to do everything I'd had to do. And after that, the decision was made that we don't do that anymore. The person who records the battle report is a single person who does it, so that the person who's actually playing the game gets to focus entirely on playing the game and focus on the mission and focus on all that kind of thing, rather than just worrying about having to then take photographs and do all this kind of stuff. And I think that was probably the biggest education. We realised that you can't expect one person to do everything. And then after that, it was very much how we started to run things. I mean, that meant that there would be two opponents and a recorder, and that tended to work just fine then. We played some really, really big games and played some small games, and but the battle reports certainly were able to progress a lot better once we realised that was the best way of doing it.